So now we move to the next section of the studies, and this is the governance and finance section, and we'll start with Lindsay.
Great, thanks everybody for being here. It's actually an honor to be at the nexus of the nexus between Texas and Lebanon. Howdy, all my fellow Aggies in Texas. I'm excited that you're on here. But yeah, I'd like to talk about the governance subtopic of the research that I'm doing. And let me start by saying that for Nexus implementation to happen, it's going to come at the governance level, the policy level, and this is what this research is tapping into. My research specifically was analyzing 4 governance factors that affect agencies' efforts to reuse water. We talked about at the beginning of our presentation as a nexus about this 40% gap that exists between the 40% gap between water supply and water demand. Specifically in the San Antonio region, there's also a very similar identified water gap. The graph that you see here highlights the increased demand of water in the blue, and then those orange blocks right there represents the strategy supply of water reuse that the Texas Water Development Board has identified can be a viable water resource to bridge that gap. So with knowing this, with quantifying this from the Texas Water Development Board, the next question was, what are we doing as policy, as governance, as water authority to make sure that we're captivating that water? And so that leads me to my objectives of my research, and that was to identify and analyze the types of agencies that are contributing to water reuse, and also determining if these agencies are working with the State Water Board to develop this as a resource. So next is the method to the madness, if you will. We identified, again, region L and region K was going to be, for this study, the boundary that we were going to use. I developed a questionnaire research to address these water authorities. So the next was to identify who were we going to address. We looked at nearly 280 water authorities. If you can imagine an area like this and identifying 280 agencies that have authority over water. It's a big map, it's a big thing to tackle. So this came from different types of agencies like private utility, groundwater, river authority, state planning, and also academia. Next was developing the questionnaire survey. And the questions that I addressed, I specifically asked them how these agencies were contributing to reuse or how they were increasing water reuse for the region. And also I was asking them, how frequently do you communicate with the State Water Planning Board? The idea was you have all these agencies, how are they coordinating with the top dog to plan for water in the future? Next, I sent this questionnaire survey via online and in mail. And once the responses were received, the answers were coded and were used for statistical analysis. We identified 280 water authorities, and we came back, we had about 80 responses who sent back. So it was about a 25% response rate. And so the key findings was I looked at 4 main factors. One was how familiar these agencies were with the State Planning Board. TWDB is the Texas Water Development Board, and how familiar were they with the strategies of water reuse. The second one was frequency and communication with Texas Water Development Board. Do you communicate with them once a week, once a month? Never was an answer. Then scale of agency and also the type of agency. Scale included local, regional, and state, and type included private, utility, river authority, state planning, research extension, and groundwater. So what I found was, Basil, one more back, please, was that frequency and communication with the Texas Water Development Board was statistically significant to increasing water reuse in this region. Yeah, next slide. Another imperative finding that I found out of this was that out of all of the survey, there was 58% of the agencies that didn't communicate at all, like whatsoever, with the Texas Water Development Board. So this is very alarming news. And so as we look at the technological advances that we've seen to increase water reuse, as well as economic assessments or mechanisms, if you will, to reuse water in different communities, coupled with there's been a larger push for social adaptation, so getting communities more familiar or okay with reusing drinking poo water, if you will. The next step is kind of the governance. How is the governance tackling this issue? How are they implementing reusing water? And so at the key of the nexus is that the water crisis is really a governance crisis, and as we continue forward with the nexus, this continued research will benefit. So thank you so much. Oh, any questions? Are there any questions?
Thank you, Lindsay. We'll take the Q&A after we're done with this with the governance segment.
Okay, thanks, Pavel.
Thank you, Lindsay. The last paper we have for today is also one that was done hand in hand also with the survey that Lindsay just presented. This is going to talk about creating an environment of cooperation between water, energy, and food players in the San Antonio region. I'd also like to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Bryce Hannibal, Ken Portney, and Mohtar. And I'd like to start by bringing your attention to this map here of San Antonio. So this is a zoomed out map of the map that we saw earlier on Texas. And all of the dots that you see here on the map are water wells. All of these this is the spatial distribution of the different water wells that exist in the San Antonio region. The blue dots are water wells that are used for municipal use. The red dots are water wells used for energy production, and the green dots are used for agriculture. So we can clearly and quickly start seeing the extent of competition that exists between these three growing sectors in that region. And despite our knowledge of that type interconnection between the three growing sectors and the three resource systems, we know little about the level of communication between those who are making decisions within water, energy, and food institutions in the area. So one of the main objectives of this area, of this study, was to quantify that level of communication. How often do these people, who are clearly very interconnected and their decisions are very much affecting each other, how often do they communicate? So we wanted to develop kind of a benchmark of understanding that. The second, we wanted to look at different factors that might have a role in affecting that communication. So we wanted to evaluate the relation between the water officials' perception of future water challenges and see if that has any impact on whether they would communicate more or less with other energy and food or water players in the region, and also evaluate the relation between their participation in different resource planning stakeholder forums and that level of communication. So we sent out the survey to 257 public officials, 101 of which responded, and we again asked them about the frequency of communication they have with different water institutions, energy institutions, food, and cross-cutting institutions. And the cross-cutting category includes institutions like the mayor's office, different planning agencies, which do not necessarily fit under a water, energy, or food category. So, and one of the methods that we used was the survey, where we asked that question. And one thing that we learned is that we have a low level of communication overall between water, energy, and food stakeholders in the region. So most of those who responded to the survey marked no communication at all for most of the institutions. So we can see here that more than 80 and 90% of the questions that we asked about that frequency of communication showed that there is no communication at all. There was more communication we noticed between water and other water officials compared to water and other energy stakeholders in the region, which was statistically significant, which shows that, which confirms the idea that we have that we talk among each other within our separate silos and circles. So probably when we go to water meetings, it's mostly water people, and we don't have enough energy and food folks to engage with, even though we do recognize the importance and the interconnections between the three. And one other method we use to complement the map that I showed you earlier of the distribution of the resources is the network map. So yes, we do realize that we have that level of competition when we spatially look at the different wells and the growing sectors. But how does that map look when we look at it from a communication, social, and networking perspective? So the map you see here looks at all the levels of communication that exist between those that we surveyed and different blue, who are water, red, who are energy, and green, who are food stakeholders in the region. And we can quickly see that once we look at a higher frequency of communication, so this is the same map as this, and we can quickly see how most of the map, network map, drops when we look at more frequent level of communication. So this map shows weekly communication, and we can see that most of those who were surveyed, if communication exists, it actually also exists with water players. So they are water players, and they're mostly connected with water players at a weekly frequency. So some of the key messages that we'd like to share out of this study is the importance of combining that biophysical understanding and social understanding, and its power in unlocking some potential solutions and interventions that could give us a better understanding of those hotspots rather than just looking at it from a biophysical perspective. We can see in San Antonio that the resources and the challenges are interconnected, yet we have low levels of communication across sectors. We found that we have higher levels of communication among water officials compared to water with energy. There was a positive correlation between attending stakeholder engagement forums and higher communication, but only among water officials, which again confirms the point that we need to be more inclusive in our stakeholder forums of more energy and food folks as well. There was insufficient evidence to the relation between the level of communication and concern about water availability. So even though a lot of stakeholders showed concern about future water availability, there was little communication that existed, which also gives us, makes us think of what are some of the barriers for communication, which might be at the institutional level, which makes us think of different mechanisms and resource allocation that needs to be formally done at the different institutions level to facilitate that flow of communication and information across different institutions. So which leads me to the following point: the need to invest in developing those mechanisms to promote a higher level of communication. Integrative planning workshops need to be more inclusive and particularly include members of the energy sector, and I would also add the food and agriculture sector, definitely. So this is what I have for this study, and now we'll move to Q&A 5 on the governance and financing for the last two papers.
Any questions, please? Any questions from AUB?
Lindsay,
Yeah.
there are 1,700 stakeholders, water utilities in Texas. There are 8 in Lebanon. What similarities you see, what differences you see as you start embarking on doing that exercise in Lebanon? What do you see the challenges here?
The challenges are another political dynamic, I would say, to evaluate them. A little bit. So I'm currently doing research here and evaluating water authorities, and yeah, some of the complexities have to do with the different sensitivity of the different areas. Not something I was used to actually in Texas, because it's very defined areas. Everything is very explicit, and their data is very available, but there's a lot of kind of different political things that are coming up here.
Yeah. To follow up on the issue of the water authorities in Lebanon, you have also the water vendors, and so you have actually, although you could be talking about officially 8 or whatever water authorities you mentioned, but then you have the whole problem and issue of water vendors that are the private sector, the people who interact with these water authorities in a very complicated way. So I think if you can look at exactly that extra factor that's very unique. I don't know whether it's unique to this country, but it's very common that we end up buying, rather than receiving money, water from the municipality, we actually pay money to water vendors that most probably are getting the water from the municipality. So there's some kind of a cycle that needs to be understood better. So it would be great if you look at that angle too.
My one comment to that is, as we're talking about a WEF NEXUS stakeholder dialogue, I think there really needs to be a buy-in from the authorities before including all of them. I see this as like a facilitating more of, but I totally agree. They're kind of the powerhouse, if you will.
Yeah. We actually have a question from Texas.
Yes, it's a question to either Lindsay or Vessel. So having a more inclusive approach will definitely improve decision making. But do you think, in your opinion, that having so many different agencies interact might prolong the decision making process? And is it something that is some research underway to propose some sort of a decision making framework for these agencies that can have some level of engagement amongst the agencies, but does not expand to all the agencies that can result in like a delayed decision-making process? So,
thank you. One of the things we're basically looking at is suggesting mechanisms that will help these institutions or identify barriers for no communication. So the research that we did showed us very little communication.
Russell, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good. Thank you.
Yes. What I was saying is that as a result of the low level of communication that we were expecting, and it was confirmed by our survey, there is little coordination that is happening between institutions now, which has the potential of developing plans for the coming 10 or 20 years with little coordination between them, which would result into policies that are incoherent or inconsistent over time. So what we're trying to push for here or highlight is the need for greater communication, not as a way to prolong the process, but just to ensure that there's some kind of synergy that is being made throughout that planning processes, and that we are aware of what other institutions are doing, and highlighting the need of providing a mechanism that will help that cross-cutting communication to happen.
We had 2 more questions from AUB quickly.
Actually, it's just a comment on Dr. Nouaihid's talk about the private water. And actually, we have one of our graduates. She's now at UC Davis doing her PhD research on informal water use in Lebanon, which is, as you mentioned, it's really specific to Lebanon. And she's now currently doing this.
Next question.
Okay, it's me again. If we continue in the same line of a bit of the comparatives between, let's say, San Antonio and Lebanon, even though Lebanon would be just a small neighborhood in San Antonio, But when we looked at the map with all the wells, all the mapped out wells, and we see that we have 3 categories of these wells. If we map out all the wells that exist in Lebanon, we might have more. And I assume that the maps, the wells that we have on that map are legal.
Yeah.
Over here, what we know about is maybe the 10 or 20% of the legal wells that are legislated or approved. But we have thousands or millions of illegal water abstraction. And whenever we are tackling the water governance in Lebanon, we only deal with the existing legal wells. And all the illegal water abstraction, water wells that are there, that are doing whatever they want, they're never part of the stakeholders. We never go and deal with the outlaws and bring them on the table to put them in this circle and try to control them. So they're outlaws, we never put them on the table. The Ministry of Water and Energy doesn't want to deal with them. Nobody wants to deal with them, but they are taking out all these resources. So it's just a challenging kind
of... true.
How do we deal with this on a governance level?
Very true. Lindsay will solve that. We're approaching the last segment. I'm mindful of the time and we'll respect that. The last segment